Welcome back to World Cup history. I am your World Cup historian, Lavender Bai, and play the song because for the first and only time in history, football is coming home. It's England 1966, baby. But before we talk about the World Cup, we probably need to talk about the fact that this was hardly a World Cup at all. The 1966 World Cup had 16 spots available, 10 of which were reserved for Europe, one automatically going to England as the hosts, with 32 teams contesting the remaining 9. South America were given 4 spots, with Brazil getting automatic qualification as the previous winners. 9 teams ended up contesting the remaining 3 spots. Then you've got Central America, North America, and the Caribbean, who had 1 guaranteed spot between them, contested by 10 teams. And then there was all of Africa and Asia, with 19 teams contesting a playoff for 1 single spot. We're talking about a landmass that housed a majority of the world's population, all fighting it out for just 1 spot. Talk about Eurocentric football. Basically, Africa would hold 1 set of qualifications and Asia would hold their own, with the winners of both battling it out for a single chance at the World Cup. So Australia wasn't yet part of Asia in terms of football, so they participated in qualification through Oceania, but failed to qualify. Before qualification started, the Philippines and Republic of Congo's applications were rejected. And then there was the whole South Africa thing. So the African Football Federation expelled South Africa in 1958 as a direct result of the country's apartheid policy. But in 1963, FIFA readmitted them after they pledged to send a multicultural team.
Sure, Jan.
The rest of Africa is obviously furious because they know this won't happen under apartheid law. Basically, this means that they have to qualify through Asia rather than Africa, which means they would play against Australia, North Korea, and South Korea at a tournament in Japan. However, by the time the tournament begins, South Africa are disqualified due to apartheid. Finally. And then South Korea withdraw due to logistical difficulties as a result of the tournament being moved to Cambodia. This means Asian qualification is now down to North Korea and Australia. Australia is so close to World Cup qualification. And then North Korea smacked us 9-2 on aggregate. Yikes. But back to Africa. So October 1964, all 15 African nations announced they are boycotting the tournament, not just because of the South Africa stuff, but because of the lack of representation overall. So African President Yidnekatu Tessima responded saying, FIFA has adopted a relentless attitude against African associations and its decision to resemble methods of intimidation and repression designed to discourage any further impulses of a similar nature. In our opinion, the African national associations really deserved a gesture of respect rather than a fine. Turns out the boycott worked because that was the last time we had a World Cup with 0 African representation. The boycott also had an unintended consequence. It cleared the path for the most unexpected team in World Cup history to qualify. A team the British government wasn't even sure they wanted to let into the country. But we'll get to them later. First, the world in 1966. Okay, let's set the scene. Welcome to England in the 60s. The swinging 60s, to be precise. The Beatles are just about to release Revolver, widely considered one of the greatest albums ever made. Beatlemania is in full swing. The Rolling Stones are on the radio, Twiggy is on every magazine cover, the miniskirt has redefined fashion. Liverpool just won the title, and the Brits had just patented the ATM machine. The 60s were hedonistic, modern, and unmistakably cool. Britain may have lost its empire, but it found something more interesting. Cultural relevance. The Brits were the center point of the cultural zeitgeist. They produced the music, the fashion, the culture, and soon, England would have the World Cup. England had been awarded the World Cup as a little treat to celebrate the Football Association's centenary in 1963. But the country didn't get around it the way you'd think. In 1965, The Observer said the World Cup had been, quote, a shabby story of neglect and dithering over 4 years. Sports Minister Dennis Howe managed to secure £500,000 of government funds towards tournament prep, which was the first time in history that government funding was used to fund a specific sport. But PM Harold Wilson said that this was, quote, essential to Britain's economic and social development. So the thing about Harold Wilson is he was a football fan, or at least was a fan of using football as a political pawn. He apparently interrupted one of his election rallies in 1966 to give a score update for the football. Wilson was elected just months before the World Cup kicked off, and he'd later boast that England only ever won a World Cup under a Labour government. So as you would expect, Wilson was at Wembley for the final, and obviously he milked the applause at the celebration banquet. He tried to persuade the BBC to let him give an expert analysis of the match at halftime. Obviously, they said no. So 4 years later, Wilson held the 1970 general election during the World Cup and was genuinely concerned about the impact England's performance might have on the result. In April 1970, he called a cabinet meeting at Chequers where he asked his ministers to consider, quote, whether the government would suffer if the England footballers were defeated on the eve of polling day. Cabinet Minister Richard Crossman recorded Wilson saying, quote, one of the problems was the World Cup. If it wasn't for that, he would favour the end of June. Ultimately, England would go on to lose to West Germany in the quarterfinals 4 days before polling day, and Labour lost the election. Wilson immediately said that the result of a football match has nothing to do with the governance of a country. In a surprise to nobody, he had no further comment on the relationship between football and politics. But there's an added bit of context that often gets left out of the whole swinging 60s narrative. By 1966, there was a population of almost 1 million immigrants living in Britain. We had the Windrush generation from the Caribbean, South Asians from Pakistan and India, and by the time the 1965 Race Relations Act was introduced, the Museum of London said that, quote, casual colour prejudice was a part of daily life for these communities. Landlords advertised rooms saying no coloured, no Irish. Employers rejected applications. Pubs refused service. It was a whole thing. So to put everything in context, the Race Relations Act of 1965, only 1 year old when the World Cup kicked off, was the first UK statute to prohibit racial discrimination in public places. It was widely considered to be toothless. There was no enforcement mechanism, no courts, just like an honour system, I guess. And so to put this into football terms for you, England's 1966 World Cup squad was entirely white in a tournament that had 0 African representation. This was at the same time that the host nation was celebrating its most creative cultural moment in history and passing its first ever anti-discrimination law. But everything was still overwhelmingly white. This is the England that hosted the World Cup. And somehow, the World Cup they won. Okay, so let's talk about the team the English government wasn't sure they wanted to let in. North Korea. North Korea had qualified for the World Cup by beating Australia 9-2 on aggregate. The only team left standing after the African boycott cleared the field. A devastating turn of events for me as an Australian, and as it turns out, a bad vibe for the English as well. The English government had a diplomatic crisis on its hands. England and North Korea were technically still at war. The Korean War had ended with an armistice in 1953, but there was no peace treaty. Technically, England refused to even recognise DPR Korea as a legitimate nation. The Foreign Office considered refusing visas to the North Korean squad entirely. You have to remember, we are in the middle of the Cold War, and we've just gone through 2 world wars since the start of the century.
2 world wars and 1 World Cup. England, England. 2 world wars and 1 World Cup. England all the way. Oh, you got it, my son. We're going to blow them away, eh?
So England had to be really careful not to rock the boat with the US or with South Korea. But then FIFA stepped in. An internal Foreign Office memo written just months before the tournament stated, quote, if we do this, the consequences could be very serious. Apparently, FIFA has made it very plain to the FA that if any team that has won its way through to the finals is denied visas, then the finals will take place elsewhere. This could be a disaster for the FA. You can imagine what the papers would make of this. England ultimately let them in. But the Foreign Office engineered a series of workarounds to minimize the diplomatic fallout of the whole thing. National anthems would only be played at the opening match and the final, not before any other games. This meant North Korea's anthem would never be played as long as they didn't make the final. The Foreign Office, clearly believing they knew a thing or two about football, gambled that North Korea were insufficiently talented to reach the final. So diplomatically speaking, the Queen could not appear in photographs with the North Korean squad. Meetings between players and state figures were restricted to the opening match and the final only, neither of which involved North Korea, as long as the plan held. So there was a Foreign Office suggestion that flags outside stadiums should be removed after each team's elimination. Time to ensure that North Korean flag disappeared early was vetoed by the Department of Education and Science. A commemorative stamp featuring all 16 nations was also cancelled because it included the North Korean flag. It's even been rumoured that the draw for this tournament was fixed so that North Korea played all their group games in Middlesbrough. This was far away from London, away from the diplomatic spotlight in a working-class industrial town, where any awkward encounters with government officials or foreign dignitaries would be minimal. This was never confirmed, but it's certainly a coincidence. So North Korea came to England, but before they got on the plane from Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung met the squad personally. His instructions were, "I urge you to win 1 or 2 matches." Now, obviously, you don't want to be rubbing shoulders with dictators at the best of times, but comparatively, if we look at other World Cups, this isn't the worst interaction you could have with a dictator ahead of a World Cup. We all remember Mussolini literally threatening to kill people. So on the train out from London, the North Korean delegation stunned and amused passengers by bursting into patriotic songs celebrating their country. They even came bearing gifts. The ice was broken when the Middlesbrough mayor accepted the team's gift of an embroidered picture of a bird. Sweet, if you think about it. The North Korean players were polite, humbled, and clearly thrilled to be there. They waved to crowds, signed autographs, and showed genuine joy at experiencing the world beyond their borders. And coincidentally, they wore red, the same colour as Middlesbrough, so the locals adopted them immediately. The friendship that developed between the North Korean squad and the people of Middlesbrough went far beyond the tense relationships between the English and North Korean governments. So on the pitch, North Korea lost their first game to the Soviet Union 3-0. They then drew 1-1 with Chile, and then came Italy. Italy, the 2-time world champions. Italy's manager had been so dismissive of North Korea, he'd barely bothered to scout them. The Italian press treated the match as merely a formality. One of Italy's key players, Bulgarelli, made a rough tackle that injured him badly enough he had to leave the pitch. And obviously, it's 1966, so there's no substitutions. Italy were down to just 10 men. And then came the goal. Park Do-ik, a military dentist who played football in his spare time, scored against Italy. North Korea would go on to beat Italy 1-0 in one of the greatest upsets in World Cup history. Park Do-ik later said, quote, "When I scored that goal, the people of Middlesbrough took us into their hearts." Obviously, DPR Korea didn't have fans from back home. The North Korean fans were unable to travel, so thousands of locals filled the stands to cheer them on as their own. Italy, on the other hand, went home. At the airport, they were pelted with rotten tomatoes by furious fans. So what happened to the North Korean players after? Rumours circulate for decades that the players had been sent to labour camps for getting drunk and fraternising with Western civilians after beating Italy. But the players denied this when a British filmmaker tracked them down in 2002. Most of the players lived normal lives after the tournament. They went home, returned to their jobs, some of them in the military, others as workers, and were celebrated as national heroes. Park Do-ik actually ended up going on to work as a gymnastics instructor. They spoke fondly of their time in England, and particularly the warmth of Middlesbrough. The players wrote a letter to the people of the town. Quote, "The cheering voices of the citizens of Middlesbrough remain fresh still in our memory. We can clearly remember the people of Middlesbrough who warmly had welcomed us. We are looking forward to seeing you with the warm and friendly feelings of 36 years ago." I mean, who'd have thought that the North Korean national team would find themselves fans in Middlesbrough, England? The defending champions, Brazil, as shown on my shirt, arrived in England as 2-time world champions, 1958 and 1962. They had Pele, they had Garrincha, they had the most talented squad in the world. They were going for a three-peat a la the Penrith Panthers. But they were eliminated in the group stage. In Brazil's first game against Bulgaria, Pele was singled out for brutal treatment, targeted every time he touched the ball, hacked and fouled, with the referee doing almost nothing to protect him. He scored off a free kick, becoming the first player to score in 3 consecutive World Cup tournaments. And then he limped through the rest of the match. He missed the second game against Hungary through injury, and ultimately Brazil would lose 3-1. They needed to beat Portugal in their final group game, or they would be sent packing. Portugal had clearly seen what Bulgaria's approach had achieved, and Pele was chopped down with a brutal double foul while the referee did nothing. Pele had to hobble through nearly 90 minutes because, no substitutions in 1966, as Brazil were beaten 3-1 and eliminated. Brutal. Pele left the tournament unable to walk. He told reporters he would never play in another World Cup. Quote, "Football stopped being an art, stopped drawing crowds by its skills, and instead became an actual war." Obviously, he changed his mind 4 years later. He came to Mexico in 1970 and won the whole thing. But more on that next week. Before we get to the quarterfinals, we need to talk about the man who is about to become the story of this tournament. His full name is Eusébio da Silva Ferreira. He was born on January 25, 1942, in the capital of Portuguese Mozambique. His mother raised 5 children alone. And his neighborhood was one of the poorest in the city. The neighborhood bordered the white elite part of the city, separated not by distance, but by class. He would play football with rolled up newspapers because that was all they had. At 15, a Juventus scout spotted him and wanted to take him to Italy. But his mother refused to let him go. Then a Brazilian touring side came through Mozambique, and their coach, a former World Cup player named Carlos Bauer, watched Eusébio play and told his contact in a Lisbon barbershop about a teenager who could run 100 meters in 11 seconds and had scored 77 goals in 42 games. That contact was Bela Goodman, Benfica's manager. Goodman flew to Mozambique immediately and signed him. But Eusébio had been playing for Sporting Lisbon's feeder club in Mozambique, meaning that Sporting had a claim on him. So, to avoid detection, Benfica gave him a code name, Ruth Meloso. He was brought to Portugal in December 1960 and hidden in a fishing village while lawyers fought over his registration. Sporting would ultimately go on to lose the battle, and Benfica got their player. In Lisbon, Eusébio had no community. In Mozambique, he had been subjected to open racism under Portuguese colonial rule, but at least he was part of a majority. In Lisbon, the racism was less overt, but he felt completely alone. Football became his only community. And he became the best player in Europe. He won the Ballon d'Or in 1965, won the European Cup with Benfica, scored goals that made crowds go wild. Clubs across the continent wanted him, but Benfica refused to sell. He even personally appealed to Portuguese dictator Antonio Salazar for permission to leave, but Salazar denied the request on the grounds that he, quote, belonged to the Portuguese people. This was a man raised in colonial Mozambique, raised in poverty under apartheid law, whose transfer had to be conducted under a fake name, who personally begged a fascist dictator for the right to move clubs. And by the time the regime fell in 1974, he was 35 and no longer of interest to the top European clubs. So he never got his move. But in the summer of 1966, he arrived at his first and only World Cup, and thank God. So he sort of came in with a point to prove. He had already finished as the leading goal scorer in European qualifying and had just scored Portugal their first ever ticket to a World Cup. So as you could expect, everybody in the world had been waiting to see him on the biggest stage. So Portugal were drawn in Group 3 alongside Hungary, Bulgaria, and defending champions Brazil, who still had Pele and Garrincha. Nobody expected Portugal to win the group. But Portugal went on to beat Hungary 3-1 in their opener, then beat Bulgaria 3-0. This is when Eusébio scored his first goal of the tournament. Then came Brazil. Portugal beat them 3-1 in the final group game, with Eusébio scoring again. Pelé, who was systematically kicked out of the tournament by Portuguese defenders, embraced Eusébio at the final whistle. Photos from this moment go to show two men holding each other, two of the greatest players of their generation on opposite sides of a result, still finding each other in the chaos. Pelé later said of Eusébio, "A player like Eusébio comes along every 50 years." Portugal would go on to top the group while Brazil was sent home in the group stage. So this is where we see the most extraordinary individual performance of the 1966 World Cup. In their quarterfinal against North Korea at Goodison Park, Portugal conceded in the first minute. Within 25 minutes, they trailed 3-0. Those watching at home turned off their radios and turned off their TVs. Nobody had ever come back from 3 goals down in a World Cup knockout match. But then Eusébio scored in the 27th minute. Then a penalty in the 43rd. Then again in the 56th. Then another penalty in the 59th. 4 goals in 32 minutes. And then one more goal meant that Portugal won the game 5-3. In their first World Cup, Portugal had equaled the record for the largest deficit overcome in a World Cup knockout match. And then the semi-final. Portugal v England at Wembley. Bobby Charlton would score twice and Portugal would lose 2-1. But on a personal note, Eusébio scored a penalty in the 82nd minute. This was his 9th goal of the tournament, but it wasn't quite enough to keep Portugal in it. At the final whistle, Eusébio walked off the pitch in tears. Photos of him crying became some of the most reproduced images of the tournament. The match had been moved to Wembley at the last minute after the Football Association had requested it. And this sucked for Portugal. So they had the right to host it as the higher-ranked team, which would have meant it would have been played in Liverpool. But FIFA agreed to England's request. Portugal played the semi-final at their opponent's home ground. Portugal would go on to beat the Soviet Union in the third-place playoff, with Eusébio scoring again. He would ultimately win the Golden Boot for 9 goals in 6 matches. But he would go on to never play another World Cup. His waxwork was immediately added to Madame Tussauds in London, and he won the BBC Overseas Sports Personality of the Year award for 1966. But the interesting thing about this is what it meant for him to be playing in England in 1966. This is a country that's just passed its first ever law prohibiting racial discrimination in public places. A country where landlords openly advertised rooms with signs saying no coloured people. Where pubs refused service. It was only 8 years ago in Notting Hill that white gangs were attacking West Indian men in the streets of West London. And English crowds were now celebrating Eusébio. They just loved him. It was later said, quote, "In the 1960s, Eusébio was a legend for black people across Europe. He and Pelé were symbols for black people in becoming more prominent, not just in football, but in life." So there you go. You've got a black man from colonial Mozambique playing for the country that colonized him in a nation that had only just legislated basic racial equality because it needed to, in front of crowds who gave him a standing ovation when he cried. And people still say that football is not political. When Alf Ramsey was appointed England manager in 1963, he made a bold prediction. Quote, "We will win the World Cup." Few people believed him, and if you've watched any other World Cup before or after 1966, you probably wouldn't have believed him either. But 1966 was different. Ramsey's tactical innovation was to remove traditional wingers entirely. The wingless wonders. Compact, discipline, flooding the midfield, creating through organisation what other teams created through flair. England would draw their opening game with Uruguay 0-0. They were widely criticised. The swinging 60s was happening all around them, and the nation was struggling to care about an England team that couldn't score against Uruguay. Gordon Banks kept clean sheets through all 3 group games. England beat Mexico and France and reached the quarterfinals. Okay, we're back. If the lighting and the audio looks and sounds different, it's because my camera and my microphone both simultaneously died, and I'm sick, so we're continuing where we left off. Let's get back into it. The quarterfinal against Argentina is where 1966 truly revealed its character. July 23, 1966, 90,000 people pack out Wembley Stadium. Argentina had arrived in England with a bit of a reputation already. FIFA had already formally cautioned them for their violent style in the group games, particularly in a goalless draw with West Germany, in which Argentine player Rafael Albrecht was sent off and suspended for the next match. From the first minute, the quarterfinal was marked with fighting. So even before the famous incident in the 35th minute, 3 Argentines and both Bobby and Jack Charlton had already been cautioned. The Charlton brothers only learned of their cautions the next day from a newspaper. At the time, cautions were given verbally in the referee's native language, and nobody heard theirs. The referee was Rudolf Kreitlein, a German tailor from Bavaria. He did not speak a lick of Spanish. In the 29th minute, Ratin was cautioned for tripping Bobby Charlton. 3 minutes later, he was cautioned again. This time for constantly badgering the referee after 2 Argentine players had been penalised in quick succession. 2 cautions, sent off. But there were no red cards. There were no yellow cards. There were no cards at all. Kreitlein verbally sent Ratin off with a gesture pointing to the tunnel. But Ratin didn't understand, or he refused to understand. So Ratin said, I saw that all of his decisions favoured England. Corners, fouls, he even invented handballs. I showed him my captain's armband and asked for an interpreter for several minutes to ask for explanations. I couldn't believe it when he sent me off. Kreitlein's version differs quite substantially. He said that he admitted he didn't understand a word of Spanish. He described the dismissal as being for, quote, violence of the tongue. So violence of the tongue is an offence that didn't exist in any rulebook. It was sort of just delivered on the spot by this referee who couldn't communicate with the player he was dismissing. And of course this happened in front of 90,000 English fans. Ratin refused to leave, and the game was actually stopped for nearly 10 minutes. And Ken Aston, the English supervisor of referees, the same Ken Aston who had refereed the Battle of Santiago 4 years earlier, came onto the pitch to escort Ratin to go. But his presence only made things worse, as the South American teams already suspected the English and Germans were collaborating to eliminate them. Ratin eventually took the long walk around the touchline, and on his way, he scrunched up a corner flag bearing the Union Jack in his hand. He took a seat on the red carpet of the Queen's royal box. Thankfully, the Queen was not in the stadium. He ate pieces of chocolate thrown down by English fans and threw them back, and he sat there dodging beer cans. Kreitlein had to be escorted from the field by police after the final whistle for his own protection. England would go on to win 1-0 after Geoff Hurst headed a Martin Peters cross. Bobby Charlton later described this as, quote, the best England goal I ever saw in my time with the squad. At full time, Ramsey ran onto the pitch to physically stop his players from swapping shirts with the Argentines. He was later asked to clarify his comments in a press conference and said, quote, the behaviour of some players reminds me of animals. After the match, an Argentine player spat at the FIFA vice president and received a 3-match ban. Another player ripped the referee's shirt. In Argentina, the match became known as El Robo di Siglo, the robbery of the century. An Argentine newspaper published a picture of World Cup Willie, the World Cup mascot, dressed in pirate regalia. The message was clear. The England-Argentina rivalry that would define the next 30 years of football started in that bad-tempered 90 minutes at Wembley. This is when the rivalry started that gave us Maradona's Hand of God goal. Former Argentine international Roberto Perfumo put it simply. In 1986, winning that game against England was enough. Winning the World Cup was secondary for us. Beating England was our real aim. Ken Aston, driving home from Wembley after watching the match from the sidelines, stopped at traffic lights on Kensington High Street. The light turned red. He thought, yellow means caution, red means stop. You're off the field. He went home and his wife made him 2 cards out of construction paper. We spoke about his role in the last episode in the Battle of Santiago, but it was this match between England and Argentina that truly birthed the red card. Okay, we're nearly at the final, but first we need to talk about Jimmy Greaves, England's greatest natural goal scorer. Some call him the most gifted finisher the country has ever produced. He scored 44 goals in just 57 international appearances. In the years heading into the tournament, he was England's all-time top scorer. But his story begins not in 1966, but in 1961. Greaves was sold to AC Milan for £80,000. His stay in Italy, though, was unsuccessful. He never adapted, he was deeply unhappy, and he still scored 9 goals in 14 appearances, but he wasn't having a good time, so he returned to Spurs. He specifically returned for £99,999. Bill Nicholson specifically chose this amount so he wouldn't be saddled with the tag of England's first £100,000 player. And at Spurs, he was brilliant. FA Cups, a European Cup, a Winners' Cup, goals in every competition. Going into 1966, he was expected to be England's key attacking threat. But in England's final group stage match against France, he needed 14 stitches in his shin. While he recovered, Geoff Hurst came in and played well. Greaves sat in the stands at Wembley and watched his teammates win the World Cup. He later said, "I danced around the pitch with everyone else, but even in this moment of triumph and great happiness, deep down I felt my sadness. Through my years as a professional footballer, I had dreamed of playing in a World Cup final. I had missed out on the match of a lifetime and it hurt." And unfortunately, he didn't receive a winner's medal. So FIFA rules at the time meant that only players who actually played in the final got a medal. So it wasn't until 2009, 43 years later, that the FA presented him with a special medal. And he would only play 3 more times for England after that match. And after his playing career ended, he descended into alcoholism. At his worst, he was drinking half a bottle of vodka before the pubs even opened in the morning. He told a newspaper, quote, "I am a very sick man. I am a social drinker who went off the rails without realizing it." But then he recovered and managed to carve out a celebrated broadcasting career. But in May 2015, a stroke left him wheelchair-bound with severely impaired speech. And in September 2021, he died aged 81. And he never fully got over 1966. He said so right up until the end. Okay, so now we're at the final. It is July 30, 1966. 96,000 people pack out Wembley Stadium. 32 million are watching on TV. England versus West Germany. West Germany's Helmut Haller scored first in the 12th minute, and then Geoff Hurst equalised with a header in the 18th. Martin Peters put England 2-1 ahead with 12 minutes remaining. You think the game's over, and then in the 89th minute, Wolfgang Weber gets one in. Equalises, extra time, baby. Let's go. Ramsey walked onto the pitch during the break. He looked at his players lying on the grass. He looked at the West Germans doing the same. And he said, "Look at them. They're finished. You've won it once. Now you'll have to go out there and win it again." England got up. Germany didn't. The 101st minute. Hurst receives the ball. He shoots. The ball hits the underside of the crossbar, bounces down, and is headed clear by a German defender. Swiss referee Gottfried Denst walks to his linesman Tafik Baramov. Anyway, he points to the center circle. Goal. And boy, oh boy, this was a controversial take. So West German captain Wolfgang Weber had what he considered a perfect view. He said, quote, "I could see clearly. That's why I was so furious. I pulled down Bobby Charlton's arms as he was already celebrating. We ran to the linesman and tried to convince him to take his decision back. 60 years of scientific analysis since this game has still not settled it. Studies by teams at Imperial College London and the University of Oxford both concluded the ball never fully crossed the line, that it would have needed to travel a further 18 centimetres to do so." Geoff Hurst's current position, quote, "I will tell anyone connected with the world of football. That ball was at least 1 metre over the line, full stop." 60 years later, that goal is still up for debate. But in the 119th minute, Hurst shoots again. This time, beyond any doubt, the ball goes flying into the top corner, with fans already on the pitch. And that's how England won a World Cup. 4-2. Bobby Moore walked up the Wembley steps in his mud-stained shirt, wiped his hands on the velvet balustrade so as to not dirty the Queen's white gloves, and lifted the Jules Rimet trophy. The most famous image in English football history, the only World Cup the English men have ever won, and the trophy that was found by a dog. England 1966 is the World Cup that refuses to end. Every England tournament since has been measured against it. Every penalty shootout exit, every quarter-final defeat, every near miss is framed against the afternoon that Bobby Moore wiped his hands clean and lifted the trophy. The phrase "football's coming home" written nearly 30 years later in 1996, exists entirely because of what happened at Wembley on June 30, 1966. Coach Alf Ramsey would be knighted in 1967, just a year later, but would ultimately be sacked in 1974 after England failed to qualify. Bobby Moore would die of cancer in 1993, age 51. The trophy Bobby Moore lifted, the Jules Rimet Trophy, was hidden in a shoebox under a bed in Rome during the war, stolen from a church in Westminster by a man who was really there to steal stamps, and ultimately found by a dog named Pickles under a hedge in South London. At the next World Cup, this trophy would be permanently given to Brazil in 1970 when they won it for a third time. A few years later, in 1983, it would be stolen once again and never be recovered. But at least for the next 4 years, football had finally come home. The next episode is Mexico 1970. Color television, the greatest team ever assembled, and a save by Gordon Banks that Pele called the best he has ever seen. And that's World Cup history, baby.